right, so picking this back up here, the next slide deals with advertising, and you're almost certain to see a question about what's an allowable advertisement. Remember, first of all, who's responsible for approving advertising? The BIC, yes. One of the things the BIC has to make sure of, in addition to the fact that there can't be any violations of fair housing law and all those kinds of things in your advertising, is the BIC has to make sure that the firm is identified in the advertising. I've given you an example here of the same property, pretty much the same ad, done multiple times. But some are allowed and some are not. Like the first one, it says 148 Main Street, 3-bedroom, 3-bath, 1,850 square feet, $178,000. Call Bob Kastner, broker, at 919-555-1212 is not allowable. And here's why that's not allowable. What does it not identify? The real estate firm that is listing the property. It identifies the broker, but that's not enough. Okay? It has to identify the firm. Whereas the same ad down here, even though it doesn't give Bob's last name, so it gives less information in that regard, but it says call Bob at United Real Estate of Raleigh. Well, because it identifies the firm, that ad is what? That's a good one. That's an allowed ad. That's an approvable ad. So make sure if you get on the test and you're looking at, is this ad okay or not, what's the first thing you're going to look for?
Brokerage firm.
Does it have the firm's name on it? Does it have the firm's name? Does it identify the firm name? All right, dual agency rules. First of all, give me the definition of dual agency. I don't like when you represent that. When one firm represents the buyer and the seller at the same time in the same transaction. You have to think of it that way. Here's the reason. Let's say that Jay is a broker affiliate with Keller Williams. And he has a listing of 123 Main Street. Okay? Tommy is also a broker affiliate of Keller Williams, and he is representing a buyer who's interested in 123 Main Street. What kind of agency relationship is this? It's dual agency. It's dual agency. I tell you what it's not. It's not designated. You know why? They didn't tell us it was designated. You don't ever assume designated dual agency. Even though there's two separate brokers in the firm, it's just what? Dual agency. Now, here's a deeper level question for you. Which client does Tommy represent in the transaction? Both. Which client does Jay represent in the transaction? Both. Which client does Jocelyn, who's not even working with either person, but is also a broker affiliate of Keller Williams, represent? Both. So if I were to ask you, who is entitled to know all the personal confidential information of the seller, what would your answer be? Everybody who's affiliated with that firm. Who's entitled to know the personal confidential information of the buyer? Everybody that's in the firm. Now, I didn't say that was a good idea, but I said who's entitled to know it. Does that make sense? Who can know it? Would we necessarily want to do it that way? Probably not, because that would prevent us from going into what kind of agency? It would prevent us from going into designated dual agency if that's something we wanted to do. Be very careful. Don't ever assume it's designated dual agency unless they make it painfully clear that it is. The only way I could use to make that designated dual agency is either just to say, Tommy has been designated to represent the buyer and Jay's been designated to represent the seller. The other word I could use would be the word advice. I could say that Jay is a broker affiliate of Keller Williams and he has a listing at 123 Main Street. Tommy's also a broker affiliate of Keller Williams and he has a buyer representation agreement where the buyer's authorized dual agency. Tommy has the freedom to advise the buyer client on what they should offer on the property. If he has the freedom to give advice, it must be what kind of agency? Designated dual agency, because that's the only form of dual agency where we can give what? Advice. Because remember, if we're in true dual agency, what's the first thing that falls away? The advice. We don't give any if we're in true dual agency. Okay? Now, before we can make an offer, what kind of permission do we need from both the buyer and the seller for dual agency? Written. before we can make an offer. That's different than before we can show. Pay attention to this, because this is one of those things that you probably haven't thought about deep enough. Permission to show. Do I need permission for dual agency even just to show the property? Yes, I do need permission. The question is whether I need that permission in writing or whether I can get it orally. Is everybody following me on this? Let's talk about the seller first. What kind of permission do I need from the seller to show their listing to a client we also represent? Does it need to be in writing or can it be oral? Seller has to be what? In writing. Even just to show. Here's why, folks. Remember, if it's already in writing, you can't change it except with more what? Writing. The seller, do we have a written agreement with them?
Yes.
Yes. And on that written agreement, does it have to say yes or no to dual agency?
Yes.
They can't possibly give oral permission because they've already put it in what? In writing. So the seller's permission always has to be what?
In writing.
In writing. That's different than the buyer's permission. Because we could be working with the buyer with what kind of an agreement? An oral agreement. If we're working with the buyer with an oral agreement, can we get oral permission for dual agency to show the property?
Yes.
Yes. But if we already have a written agreement with the buyer, what kind of permission do we need to show the property? Written. So if it's a test question and they're asking you what kind of permission you need to show the property, what are you looking for? To see if they have a buyer what? Agency agreement. If they have a written buyer agency agreement. If they have a written agreement, they need what kind of permission? Written permission. If they have an oral agreement, they can get oral permission. What kind of permission do they need to make an offer with dual agency? Written. Period. Everybody okay with that? That's one of those little narrow things where they might test you on, so be careful of that. Okay? Make sure you pay attention to the difference between the phrase representing and working with. Jen is representing a buyer is a very different statement than Jen is working with a buyer. Working with doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't tell us what team she's on. Could I say Jen is working with a buyer but she still be on the seller's team? Absolutely I could. Because working with tells me nothing. As a matter of fact, if you see on a test where it says Jen is working with a buyer, who should you assume she is working for? The seller. Because our default position is always to be on whose team? The seller's team. So what kinds of things would they have to say on the test to tell you that Jen is representing the buyer? They would have to use the word what?
Represented.
Represented. Or they would have to say she had executed a what kind of agreement? A buyer agency agreement. Does that make sense? Okay? So be very aware of the difference of working with. That's going to matter a lot on questions about when we're under contract. Because remember, when you're talking about when we're under contract, you're going to draw that dividing line between the buyer side of things and the seller side of things. You're going to make those arrows back and forth. That only works if you get everybody set up on the right side. So let me ask you, so I'll give you this. Let's say that Bernard is affiliated with HPW Real Estate. He's working with a buyer who's interested in one of HPW's listings at 5 Main Street in Garner. HPW does not practice any form of buyer agency. Whose team is Bernard on?
Seller.
He's on the seller's team. Because I said he was working with who? He's working with the buyer, but that doesn't tell me anything. He's affiliated with the listing firm, so he's automatically on the seller side, right? And I furthermore said that HPW doesn't practice any form of what? Buyer agency, which means they also don't do dual agency, because that's a form of buyer agency. So that means the only team that Bernard could possibly be on is whose? The sellers. You've got to be super careful to make sure you get people on the right team in an agency-based question. It's going to be the hardest thing about those agency questions, to make sure you have somebody put on the correct team. Don't go into the question with an assumption about how you think your transaction should work and then try to make what they said fit the assumption. Start with a clean slate and just go line by line. What are they saying is happening? Okay? That's the best advice I can give on the agency questions. Make sure you understand that in designated dual agency, it doesn't just have to be one broker on each side and one broker on that side. Can we designate 2 people to represent the seller and 3 to represent the buyer? Sure we can. Can we designate provisional brokers to work against each other as designated dual agents? Yes. Can we designate a provisional broker to work against a non-provisional broker, a full broker?
Yes. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Why would you have 3 people working for the seller? 3 people, why?
Maybe they're a team.
Oh, okay.
Maybe the listing is held by a team. You've seen teams in real estate?
Yeah.
The such and such team at RE/MAX winning it. Well, who would we designate? We would probably designate everybody that's on that what? That's on that team to represent the seller.
Do they all get an equal split, or is that?
Oh, that's what, see, you confusing the payment with the agency. Remember, the Real Estate Commission cares nothing about what? The money.
Yeah.
They simply care about the representation. It's for them to figure out the money after the fact. Yeah. So don't confuse the money part of it with the representation part. But that's a reason why you might want to do that. Another reason why you might want to do it, let's say I have 2 provisional brokers in my firm. One who has the listing and one who has a buyer client. Now, can I designate them against each other? Yeah, I can have 2 provisionals against each other. I would not feel comfortable doing that because who are they supposed to come to for advice all the time? The big. And so even though I'm allowed to do that, I would not feel comfortable. So what I would probably want to do is find a non-provisional broker to pair off with each one of them and say, okay, you know, you're going to represent the buyer, but I want you to go to Leslie if you have questions. So I'm going to designate her as well. And I would do the same thing on the other side. So it's a case-by-case thing. Is everybody okay with that? What's the one thing that can't happen with designated dual agency? What's the one combo that doesn't work? A big and a provisional broker under their supervision. Now be careful of that. I've seen them on the test before put, you know, a broker in charge and a provisional broker at another firm. Well, first of all, that's not even designated dual, that's not dual agency, that's just co-brokered, right? If they're a different firm. So make sure you pay attention to the details. But the one thing that's not allowed is a provisional broker and their own big, their own broker in charge. Is everybody okay with that? Good. As far as disclosing compensation, this was your question earlier, Jen. Any compensation that you're going to be paid in the transaction should be disclosed in writing before an offer is made. But here's where you have to be careful on the testing. Remember, they're evil. There's also a rule floating out there, which Jocelyn talked about earlier today, that says you can't talk about commissions in what document?
Offer to purchase a
The sales contract. You can never talk about commissions in the sales contract. Do you think it's possible on a test they could throw all that together and say you should disclose your compensation in writing on the sales contract? And that statement is what? That it's false. You should disclose your commissions and bonuses and all that stuff in writing, but not where? On the sales contract. You should do it on your agency agreement, in an email, on an MLS sheet, somewhere in writing, but never on the sales contract, because there's 2 things you can't talk about on the sales contract. Commissions and what else? What's the other thing you can't ever talk about on the sales contract?
There was something else.
Broker what?
Liability.
Liability. What does that mean, broker liability? What would we like to put on? What do they paint on the back of the truck? Not responsible for broken windshield. What would we like to put in the contract? By the way, that's bullshit too. They are responsible for the broken windshield. It's a lie. If they break your windshield, they're responsible for it. You know why they put it on there? Because people are dumb enough to believe it. That's why they put it on there. Okay? So we would love to put the same thing in our contracts. Think of how much less we would get sued as real estate brokers if we could stick a statement in there that says, you can't sue us. It's not our fault. Well, the Real Estate Commission says that's not allowed. So the 2 things we can't put in the sales contract, anything about our commission and anything about our liability. Is everybody okay with that? Can't show up any time in a sales contract. Yes, sir.
I got one question. Every contract I look at always has the commission attached to it. Always.
What contracts are you looking at?
Sales contract. Where our place is listed as a contract, everything. It's always got like an addendum in the back. I see them. We see them all the time.
New construction?
all, I do all.
Yeah, new construction you would see it, you would not see it in resale. And the reason you see it in new construction is they're not using brokers on their side. They're using employees to draft, to do their contracts, and they don't have to follow those rules. Yeah. But on a resale, you should not be seeing it in a sales contract anywhere. Especially not in a standardized pre-printed one. Okay. Good question. Everybody okay with that? All right, good. Handling trust money. This is sort of the last major thing that we haven't addressed very much, is handling trust monies. Let's talk about the basic rule first. If you as a real estate broker handle a client's money, money that belongs to someone other than yourself, that money needs to go into your firm's trust account. Does that make sense for everybody? It needs to go into your firm's trust account. That means in order to handle other people's money, your firm has to have what? A trust account. So, let me ask you a simple question. Can you do property management without having a trust account? No, because what's the first thing you're going to have to collect every month? Rent, and that is somebody else's money, and where does that money have to go? Into your firm's trust account. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay? There are two exceptions to that rule, and you need to be aware of them because they come into play. They come into play for you as residential brokers. An earnest money deposit that's being delivered to somebody else who's holding it. So what somebody else might be a likely destination for an earnest money deposit other than your own firm? The closing attorney. So if the earnest money is made payable to the closing attorney, you're allowed to handle it just long enough to do what with it? Give it to the closing attorney. That's one exception. What's the other type of money that you probably would put your hands on and need to get delivered to somebody pretty quickly?
Due diligence.
Due diligence fees. At due diligence fee. Folks, who is it paid by?
Buyer.
To who?
Seller.
Do the buyer and the seller usually talk directly to each other?
No.
How do they communicate with one another?
Broker.
Through the brokers. So who's most likely to pass along this due diligence fee check?
Brokers.
The real estate brokers. And that's an exemption to the rule. Those are the only two exemptions. Anything else goes where? In your firm's, don't just say trust account, your firm's trust account. Anything else goes in your firm's trust account. Are we all okay on that? All right. Now, I want to talk to you about when or how long you have to get things deposited in the trust account. Okay, the rule is 3 banking days. 3 banking days. But like most things in this class, it's not quite that simple. Don't you wish it was? It's not 3 banking days from when you get the check. It's not 3 banking days from when you get the contract. It's 3 banking days from when you have both. So, could I in theory have an earnest money deposit check in my hand for 2 weeks and still be within the rule?
Yes.
Yeah, if we're not yet what? Under contract. If we're still going back and forth and negotiating the contract, it doesn't matter that I have the earnest money check in my possession. I'm still not required to do what with it? To deposit it. I am not required to deposit it until we have both the contract and the check in hand. And then the 3-day clock starts to move. Everybody okay on that? You're looking at me funny. So,
Now, how's that protecting somebody's, isn't this rule in place to protect somebody's money when we get the money?
it is in place to protect somebody's money, but the thing of it is you're protecting both parties' money. Think of it this way. If you have an earnest money deposit check but you don't have a contract, is it really an earnest money deposit yet? No, it's not an earnest money deposit until when? Until we have a contract, that's the moment in time when you're supposed to start protecting it.
But the check would be in the trust account.
I'm sorry?
But the check would be placed in the trust account.
It would be placed in the trust account, but when does it have to be placed in a trust account?
Right.
3 days, 3 banking days after you have what? Both. Okay? So let me give you an example. Let me make you work through this. Okay? Let's say that Jen makes an offer. She's a buyer's agent, and she's making an offer on behalf of her buyer client, and the buyer goes ahead and writes the earnest money deposit check when they write the offer. Jen delivers the offer in person to the listing agent, Mandy. Okay? So now Mandy has the offer, she has the earnest money check. Is everybody with me? And that happens on Wednesday, what's today, 19th. Wednesday, September 19th. Wednesday, September 19th is this week. That happens on September the 19th. So Jen has delivered offer and earnest money check to the listing brokers. Everybody with me? The earnest money check is made payable to Mandy's firm's trust account. Is the 3-day clock ticking yet?
No.
No, because what are we missing?
Contract.
We're missing the contract. We don't have that piece yet. So the 3-day clock is not running yet. Does that make sense? So Mandy's going to present the offer to the seller. The seller counteroffers. And that happens on Thursday, the 20th. And then Jen gets back to Mandy on Friday, the 21st, saying that the buyer has accepted the counteroffer. So, do we have the contract now? Do we? Yes. And when do we go under contract?
20th.
Friday,
The 21st.
21st, right? So when does the clock start to move?
Friday the 21st.
Friday the 21st. Even though Mandy has had the check in her possession since Wednesday the 19th, the clock's not going to start to move until we also have the what? The contract. So, how long does Mandy now have to get that check deposited? 3 banking days. What's the first banking day? Monday, day 1. Tuesday, day 2. Wednesday of the following week would be the deadline for depositing that check. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so when they accept an offer, automatically you're under contract, just the acceptance in itself?
Communication of acceptance.
Okay.
But I said she did what? She informed her that they had accepted the counteroffer. That's communication of acceptance. That's the moment we're under contract. Everybody okay with that? Now, like rent, when does the 3-day clock start to count when you collect rent? As soon as you touch your hands. Because what's already in place?
Contract.
The contract, the lease is already in place before you collect the rent. Does that make sense? So now, but here's a tricky one with rent or tenant security deposits. Let's say, how many property managers, when they take an application, go ahead and get the tenant to write a check for first month's rent and security deposit with the application? Almost all of them is the answer. They do, right with the application. Has the clock started to tick?
No.
No, because we don't have what?
Contract.
We don't have a contract yet. So, they sit there and they are evaluating applications, running through applications. Can they have those checks just paperclip to that application for 2 weeks, a month? Sure they can. If they accept the tenant comes over and signs the lease, what starts to tick? The 3-day clock for depositing those checks. Yes?
So when can a owner collect the rent money?
When can an owner collect rent money? Are they using a broker or are they not using a broker?
Just using a broker.
So, what do you mean when? I'm not sure what you mean when can they
It
collect?
says can never be deposited directly to.
Ah, so brokers cannot. An owner can collect it themselves. We can't, now I see what you're asking.
Yeah.
We can't collect it, made payable to them, and deposit it in their account. If we collect it, where does it have to go? Into our trust account. So how do they get their money? We pay them from the trust account. So one of the downsides of hiring a property manager, you're going to have to wait a little while for your money. Yeah, because here's a newsflash for you. I'm not writing a check out of my trust account until I know that the funds are what? Cleared. So So when they pay me rent coming in, I'm not writing a check out the next day for rent to that owner. It's gonna be a couple weeks. I wanna make sure those funds are good before I cut a check out for the rent. So it's one of the downsides of hiring a property manager is that stopping point for the rent. The only way that the rent could be deposited directly to the owner's account is if the tenant themselves did that. Now that's gotten easier with direct drafts and transfers, right? Could you have the tenant set up a direct transfer directly from them to the owner? Yeah, as long as you don't touch the money, that'd be fine. Even if they want to Venmo them the money, that's all right too. Actually, those electronic transfers are wonderful now, especially for things like due diligence fee. The best way in the world to pay a due diligence fee is like Venmo or PayPal or one of those things. Because the last thing you want is what? Have to handle the money. I don't want to handle money that I can't keep. If I can keep it, I'll be glad to hold it for you. But if it's not mine, what do I want to do with that? Okay? I had somebody one time go, "Ooh, it must be fun managing that trust account," because my trust account had like $340,000 in it. I'm like, why would that be fun? To look at $340,000 that I can do absolutely nothing with and have to deal with balancing it every month. There's nothing fun about that. It's only, if you're having fun with it, you're probably breaking some rules along the way. That's pretty much the rule. Yes?
If you have your own firm, you don't have to have a trust account.
You do not.
Okay.
You do not. So what kinds of things would you not be able to handle?
Well, you would have to go to the attorneys.
For what?
Earnest money.
Earnest money. You can handle the due diligence fee because that's an exemption. Okay. What could you not do though? What type of brokerage could you not do?
Rental.
You can do property management because there's no way you can do property management without handling those monies and having a trust account. So yeah, you can absolutely run a brokerage firm. I no longer have a trust account because I don't want to hold anybody's earnest money deposit. I let the closing attorney hold it, and I'm not doing property management any longer. So I don't maintain one any longer. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now, as far as the rules of trust accounts, any violation at all with a trust account is called commingling. People tend to get hung up on this. For some reason, you tend to understand, if there's not enough money in the trust account, it's called what? Commingling. If there's too much money in the trust account, it's called what? Commingling. Because the definition of commingling is mixing your money with what? With trust money. Whether that mixing takes place in the account or outside of the account, if you have too little money in the account, where's the commingling happen? Outside the account. You're mixing their money with yours outside the account. If you have too much money in the trust account, where's the commingling happen? Inside the account. So either one of them is called commingling. You are allowed to have a very minimal amount of money in the account that belongs to you personally. How much is that? $100. And the only reason you're allowed to keep that in there is to cover any bank fees. Like for example, my trust account used to be at Bank of America. And they were notorious for just a random $12.50 monthly account maintenance fee. And some months it would show up and some months it wouldn't. Well, if I'm not allowed to keep any of my own money in the account and they take $12.50 out, whose money did they take? My client's money. And so you're allowed to keep up to $100 of your own money in there. Is everybody good with that? Can a trust account be interest bearing? It sure can. What do you have to do with the interest of it? Take it out how often?
Monthly.
Monthly. Monthly. It's got to be withdrawn monthly. Yes.
Do security deposits have to be in a separate trust account than rents? They can all be in the same
It can all be in the
separate
same.
account for all of
It
them.
can, I
It can just
recommend
never
separate
go
accounts,
underneath.
but you can have only one trust account and keep everything. You could do tenant security deposits, rents, earnest money deposits, all in the same trust account if you want to account for it that way. I wouldn't recommend it, but you can. Okay? It's got to be in a bank, FDIC insured bank. A credit union is not a bank, folks. And the reason credit unions don't work is they're not FDIC insured, right? It is required that it be FDIC insured. And everything about that account has to identify it as a trust account. So like, for example, the checks, they have to say trust account. The deposit slips have to say trust or escrow account. The statements that come in the mail every month has to say trust or escrow account. Everything associated with that account has to have the words either trust or escrow account printed on it. So like, for example, mine, just with the top line was Travis Everett, next line trust account. That complies with the rule. Okay. Everybody all right with that?
I mean that firms are not required to maintain a trust account.
You don't have to have one. That was Jay's question.
Okay.
You don't have to have a trust account unless you handle money that has to go into a trust account. And remember, if you're just a sales firm, if you're just doing residential sales, what two types of money do you handle?
Earnest money and
Earnest money and what?
Due diligence.
Due diligence. What did I say were the two exemptions to the rule?
Earnest money and due diligence.
Earnest money to deliver it to whoever is supposed to be holding, and due diligence fee to deliver directly to who?
Seller.
The seller. So if you're only doing sales, can you do that without having a trust account?
Yes.
Sure, you can. And that's where a lot of firms who do only sales are headed, is not having a trust account any longer. Becoming very popular. As far as dispersing money, you don't ever disperse money from a trust account unless you have both parties' permission. So like an earnest money deposit. Now this is where you got to pay attention, and you got to pay attention to me right now, you got to pay attention on the test big time. You're going to get questions about the standard offer to purchase and contract, the North Carolina Realtors 2T form. It talks about earnest money on that contract. It says the earnest money, what happens to the earnest money, for example, if the buyer terminates the contract during the due diligence period? What happens to the earnest money? It goes back to who? The buyer. If it's terminated during the contract says it goes back to the buyer, right? What does the contract say happens to the earnest money if the buyer terminates after the due diligence period?
Goes to the seller.
It's forfeited to the seller as liquidated damages, right? Liquidated damages. You remember that? That language, folks, is there for the parties, which are the buyer and the seller, and a court of law. It's not there for you if you're holding the money in your trust account. Here's what I'm saying to you. If you see a test question where they say, you're the listing firm, you're holding an earnest money deposit in your trust account. The buyer terminates during the due diligence period. What do you do with the earnest money deposit? One of the test answers is going to be refund it to the buyer automatically per the terms of the contract. That is the wrong answer, because that language is not there for you. What do you do with the money?
Give it back. No.
You hold it until you have the permission of both parties of what to do with it. We don't ever release the funds until both parties agree on what to do with it. So who would need to agree for me to give it back to the buyer?
Buyer and seller.
The seller would need to say that was okay. Flip side, if I'm holding the earnest money deposit and we go past the due diligence date and the buyer terminates, what does the contract say is going to happen with the earnest money?
Goes to the seller.
It's going to be forfeited to the seller. If I'm the one holding the earnest money, what am I going to do as a real estate broker? I'm going to wait until I have permission from the buyer to release that earnest money. You don't get to decide. That's what we mean by that. Okay? Yes, Tom.
If someone just says, saying, like.
I'm not gonna do it?
Yeah, just go to court.
That's it. They have to sue each other. That's exactly right. And that's what you tell them. So here's what I would say to the buyer in that situation. I would say, Mr. Buyer, whether I represented him or not, if I was holding the earnest money deposit, I would say, Mr. Buyer, here's exactly what the contract says about you terminating after the due diligence date. It says the earnest money will be forfeited to the seller. Now, I don't know how many different ways you can read that other than the earnest money will be forfeited to the seller. So, I'm asking you again to please release this money to the seller. If you don't, I'm going to have to inform the seller that you've refused to release it to them, and I'm also going to have to inform them that they have the legal right to sue you for it. Now, you have to decide if you think you can win a lawsuit where the contract clearly says the earnest money is going to be forfeited. Because if they get sued, are they going to lose the earnest money? And they're going to lose much more than the earnest money. Are they going to lose court costs and attorney's fees and all that? And you know how long that trial is going to take? About 15 seconds. Because as soon as the buyer's not going to have to hire an attorney, they're literally going to file a small claims action. As soon as they call the case, they're going to walk up and hand the magistrate or judge that contract, and it says the earnest money be forfeited to the seller. The magistrate or judge is not even going to talk to the seller. They're not even going to ask their opinion on the thing. They're just going to go, judgment to the plaintiff. And they're going to not only be judged for the earnest money deposit, but for the cost of filing the action, attorneys, all that kind of stuff. So the answer to your question is we would hold it till we got permission. The real world answer is most people just go ahead and release it because they understand they're going to get sued if they don't. But occasionally you do have that jerk that won't do it. It happens.
So why would someone wait past the due diligence date? Negligence?
Negligence, silliness, yeah. They can't get something accomplished, they didn't hire the appraisal fast enough, they didn't get it done early enough. I mean, well, I'll give you a perfect example. There'll be a ton of people who blow through due diligence dates right now. What just happened? There ain't nothing in that contract that says your due diligence date gets pushed back because Hurricane Florence came through. So if you went under contract 2 weeks ago and you had a 30-day due diligence period, is it going to be hard to get an appraisal right now? Because not only do you have all the appraisals that you haven't been able to do over the last few days, he's got, what he hasn't said is, he's got to revisit all the ones he did in the weeks before that, because if he did an appraisal within the 2 weeks before the hurricane, and that property hasn't closed yet, you think that lender's going to allow that closing to happen until the appraiser goes back and put their eyes on that property again? Because they might be lending on something that's underwater. So now the appraisers have to go up. So if you are up against your due diligence date, you just lost 3 or 4 or 5 days because of the storm. Now you're trying to get the appraisal scheduled and the appraisers are out 2 weeks. So it's very likely you might miss that due diligence period. So it does happen. It does happen. Okay, everybody all right? Yes, ma'am.
Can't you talk with the seller to extend that day, like that 14-day thing?
You can certainly ask for an extension.
You have to pay, obviously, so I want something.
They're gonna want some more money. They're gonna want, most likely.
But that probably would be better, having to have the date, or having to not be closed because of the fact that you have to go back. It probably would be in the best interest to pay out, or not pay out, should I say, to give the seller.
You seem to be associating closing with the due diligence period. They're not related to one another. What is the due diligence period only changes one thing? What does it change? If you get what money back? The earnest money. The only thing that changes about the due diligence period is whether the earnest money is what? Refundable or non-refundable. So asking for an extension of the due diligence period only extends the period of time where the earnest money is refundable. Doesn't really have anything to do with closing. Okay, everybody good? Good. We talked about 3 banking day rules. As far as provisional brokers, if you see that on the test, how long do you think provisional brokers have to get the money deposited? Immediately. Get it turned over to your BIC immediately if you're a provisional broker. There's no specific rule for a non-provisional broker. It's just the money has to be deposited within the 3 banking days. Yes?
So for due diligence, if you start off with it, can you automatically, I guess, I don't know if it's like a contract, but can you actually start off with it longer than average due diligence period? So that way, when you come up, you have more time.
You can start off with as long of a due diligence period as you can negotiate. But keep in mind, the longer the period of time you... Remember what you're asking for with the period of time. You're asking for a period of time where you can do what? Back out. How's the seller going to feel like giving you more time to back out? It's a negotiation. You know, what I would say is if you're on the buyer side, the ideal due diligence period is long. If you're on the seller side, what's the ideal due diligence period? Tomorrow. Sounds good to me. So the negotiation is going to be somewhere between those two. Okay? BPOs versus CMAs, and this is the last slide in there. Remember we talked about valuation, we talked about Chapter 17. We talked about the difference between a BPO and a CMA. We said that you do CMAs for who?
Clients.
Clients, people that you represent. Now can you do a CMA for a fee? Sure you can. It's still a CMA because you're doing it for who? A client. So if the client wants to pay you $100 to do a CMA, that's great. It's still a CMA. Who can do that? Provisional, non-provisional, or both? Both. It's a CMA. Be both. Here's the problem. You focus too much on the fee part of this thing. You're focused on the wrong thing. Payment of a fee is not what makes it a BPO versus a CMA. What makes it a BPO versus a CMA is who you do it for. If you're doing it for somebody that's a customer, it is a what? It is a broker price opinion. An opinion of value done for a customer, for somebody you don't represent, like a bank. They want to know how much the property's worth. They come to you. Can you tell them how much the property's worth? Sure you can, as long as you are what kind of broker?
Non-provisional.
Non-provisional, because that's called a broker price opinion. Everybody okay on that? It's called a broker price opinion. And you always use the terminology probable sales price, probable lease price. That word probable is important when you're doing a CMA or a BPO. That's the probable. Don't ever say this is what the property's worth. Because who determines what the property's worth?
The people that buy it.
Buyers do. Even appraisers are just predicting what buyers would do, right? But we have to be very careful about the language we use. That's why we have to say the probable sales price, or the probable lease price, probable listing price would be this. Everybody okay on that? That section is huge on the exam. You're going to see that stuff big time on the exam. All right. So if you want to take out your review packet, we will run through and get the high spots of what you need to be focusing on in your review.